over the weekend, we heard of a mutiny in Russia, and a lot of folks have been wondering, Kevin, what implications does this have for the end of the potential war in Ukraine? After all, the Wagner Group is essentially a hitman group that Russia has distanced itself from for years. The Wagner Group has for years been a corporation that has been funded by many different shell entities within Russia, essentially directly by the Kremlin. Think about it this way. You've got Putin's chef, Prigozhin, as they say, who happens to run these catering businesses. And then imagine you have a chef that comes to your house, and ordinarily they might get paid $500 for a catering event. You pay them $50,000. But that's because you're really just paying $500 for the food and $45,500 for guns and ammunition. You essentially hide the extra payments for salaries for killers and terrorists and weapons and bullets and bombs under shell entities.
Prigozhin, through his catering company, Concord, was making money from defense industry contracts. So he was getting contracts to provide food and other services for the Russian army, which he was then able to reinvest into the Wagner Group.
This way, when the Wagner Group does or commits atrocities, whether it's torturing people or whether it's taking over, partnering with governments like the Central African Republic and then creating gold mines in Africa, which is kind of exactly what they've done, Russia could say, nah, we don't exploit laborers in Africa or child labor to operate mines for whether it's gold or cobalt or otherwise. We don't do that. That is against what we believe. Meanwhile, in the back channels, they fund the snots out of these companies like the Wagner Group to basically do Russia and Putin's bidding. Because since they're funded by Putin, guess what? Putin has control. Now, for years, Putin has denied the Wagner Group was in control of Russia. And they've been involved in lots of things, not just gold mines or torture, but also, consider this, the oil business. For example, at one point, they had a contract for helping the Assad regime in Syria take control of oil fields. And their deal was basically, for whatever oil field you guys capture with your mercenary army, we'll give you 25% of the oil profits. Why do you think America controls like 90% of the oil fields in Syria? We like controlling resources. So don't get me wrong. It's not like America is totally hands clean here. America does this kind of stuff as well.
In the 10 years since its founding, the Wagner Group has evolved from a small guns-for-hire operation into a sprawling network of businesses that has been active on 4 continents.
But the Wagner Group is quite interesting because when you zoom in, you see that they've changed their names frequently, they've tried to rebrand, and they've regularly distanced themselves from Russia. And Prigozhin, who leads the Wagner Group, is an individual who, well, let's just say, used to be very, very close with Vladimir Putin. Seen not only at events with Vladimir Putin, seen it close to George W. Bush with Vladimir Putin in the same room as an advisor to Putin. They've regularly been close and strongly associated together with business and then, of course, the bidding of what Russia wants to happen. In many cases, this could also essentially be assassination plots. Consider, for example, when Russia has, poisoned or made disappear other political leaders. You've got, for example, Novelli, who happened to survive, but then for some reason went back to Russia and went straight to a prison work camp. Not exactly sure why he went back to Russia, but individuals have regularly gotten poisoned and killed and hunted down by Russia. And the Wagner Group is one of the sort of executory bodies for Putin, where they can say, hey, you know what? We need someone taken care of. Prigozhin actually was recently potentially going to be the victim of disappearing, at least in discussions between the Belarusian president and Putin, where Putin on Saturday suggested maybe we just need to take this guy out. And it's frequently happened in the past, whether it's as simple as what happened in the United Kingdom. You think you're safe if you leave Russia, you're not. There was an individual who was poisoned by Russia with a very radioactive gamma radiation product, some form of incredibly super powerful chemical that essentially led the individual to die a very painful death within about 21 days. And that's not great because they could have just shot the individual. But no, Putin likes to send the message of don't mess with Russia. And slowly poisoning people really reinforces the point of how Putin does his business. As you mess with Russia, you get not just pain, but you get psychological warfare as well. And so it's really odd that all of a sudden you've got this split between someone who used to be so close to Putin and funded by Putin, and now a potential mutiny in Russia. And so a lot of folks are wondering, why would Prigozhin turn on Putin? Well, Prigozhin for the past few months has been setting up this idea that, hey, look, we're recruiting all these prisoners, we're building this Wagner army, but we're not getting enough ammunition, or the defense ministry is incompetent, and I should really be running this war because I could run this war better than Russia can. And so there's been this sort of building of an ego for Prigozhin, that he's really become a lot bigger than his role had previously called for. And the mutiny that happened last weekend wasn't even supposed to happen last weekend. They essentially moved it up substantially earlier because, at least according to Wall Street Journal reports just from this morning, because unfortunately leaks gave away the plot. And Prigozhin's like, uh-oh, I guess I better get to this mutiny sooner rather than later. Well, now what do you have? Now you've got a situation where Prigozhin's apparently made a deal with the Belarusian president, or at least with Putin as well involved, where the Belarusian president apparently negotiated a deal between Putin and Prigozhin that charges could be dropped against Prigozhin if he just turns his mutiny raid of Moscow around, which is really weird that you could have Prigozhin drive the Wagner group with potentially somewhere around 5,000 to 8,000 troops straight to Russia in a 12-hour period, stop 2 hours outside, or straight to Moscow, stop 2 hours outside of Moscow, and then say, hey, you know what? We've made a deal, and I'm going to Belarus. Now, we haven't actually seen Prigozhin show up in Belarus, so there's a lot of question around, is Prigozhin actually in Belarus? 2 of his private planes have been seen showing up in Belarus. People think he is a dollar billionaire, though we're not sure if he actually is. We know he skimmed a lot of money from these 64 shell companies that the Wagner Group operates to collect money from the Kremlin. And Putin just yesterday announced and admitted that they have paid over $1 billion to the Wagner Group over the last year, and Putin's basically taken complete control and ownership of the Wagner Group, which we knew he's always had. But Putin has always distanced himself from the Wagner Group. So now what you have is a whole lot of confusion. You have this idea that Prigozhin is going to Belarus, which happens to be a few hours north of Kyiv, which kind of makes you wonder, some conspiracy theories are that, this is just a way to relocate the Wagner Group to Kyiv so they can attack from the north. Although I don't think that's necessarily likely, given that you would have to bring your military convoys to this area. There are also, which obviously we would see via satellites, given that America stalks the crap out of every move Russia and the Wagner Group make. But what you also have is you have this idea that, okay, well, maybe Prigozhin was paid the $6.2 billion accounting error that the Department of Defense in America announced that, oops, we're actually spending more on Ukraine than we thought. However, this is probably not likely to be a bag of cash. Usually when America says we're providing monetary support to a country like Ukraine, it's not solely sacks of cash. Yes, there are some financing arrangements, but usually it's here are weapons, here's training, here's military support and intelligence, and we value all of this support at a certain level, which may or may not be that actual level. But I don't know that there's an exact sack of cash, and I certainly don't think that a convenient accounting error would be the way that money would be given to entities that shouldn't be getting it. But let's be clear, there's certainly, almost certainly, is extreme involvement here by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States, whether that was potentially with their involvement in the Nord Stream pipeline or the dam that was blown up in the southern region of Ukraine in Russian-controlled territory at the time of the explosion. This dam was blown up from within the actual dam. At least that's what engineers anticipate, which means somebody clearly was able to sneak into the secured machine rooms of this dam to blow it up. Likely, of course, the mainstream media blames Russia for what they call self-sabotage, the same thing with the Nord Stream pipeline, but quite potentially it could be something driven by the Central Intelligence Agency to drive rationale for further funding in Ukraine, suggesting that Russia has lost their marbles and therefore we need to fund this war even more. It could be a false flag set up by Ukraine itself. In theory, it could be Russia, although it does seem a little odd that Russia would blow up their own pipeline or their own dam. Of course, though, there's also this argument that that's just part of Putin's psychological warfare, to just destroy everything. This is also a common strategy that has been used in war many times before. But the real question is, when it comes to Wagner, why would somebody who was previously so close to Wagner, who's only been criticizing the Russian military for the last few months, all of a sudden want to fight back and potentially challenge Putin's regime in this manner? There was some argument through leaked reports and data, some of it reported by the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal this morning, that Prigozhin was actually wanting to take hostage or take control some individuals from the Ministry of Defense. And this would be very scary, that essentially the Wagner Group would just take over the executives or the top brass, so to speak, of the Russian military, and now really challenge Putin's regime by removing the power players and removing the insulation that Putin has around him. See, Putin is extremely powerful. He's so powerful because he surrounded himself with so many loyalists, and that makes it very difficult to get Putin out of power. If it was easy to get Putin out of power, somebody could have simply been bribed a little bit of money, and maybe Putin would have accidentally sipped some green tea, much like the example that I gave of Litvinenko, who ended up getting some delicious gamma radiation and suffering a disastrous death of somewhere around 22 days of suffering. It's pretty terrible. But anyway, that's, again, the way Russia plays. So Russia plays a game of psychological warfare. And while at one point Russia denied associating with the Wagner Group, now they're basically taking full responsibility for the Wagner Group and all of their atrocities and their crimes, whether it's through shell funding or otherwise. But the question now is, what happens now, going forward, now that we've kind of more in a superficial manner gone through all of the madness following, Russia's striking of the Wagner convoy on the highway bridge, killing 30 Wagner troops, leading them to fight back and take down a Russian helicopter. Who knows? Who knows who actually attacked the Wagner group? Was it the CIA? Was it Ukraine? Was it Russia? That doesn't matter. What really matters right now is, where do we go from here? Whether Prigozhin is alive or he's dead or he was captured, he's got a gun to his family's head, which is something the United Kingdom has suggested. It's something the CIA has suggested. It is something that basically people have said that Prigozhin is just a dead man walking. The real question is, where do we stand now? And where we stand now is that Prigozhin has challenged Putin's regime. This has all either been done for a public choreographed show to manipulate the public, or potentially say that, look, the Wagner Group is responsible for all of this. They suck. They failed. You know what? Because of this, we have to end the war in Ukraine, and we're pulling out because the Wagner Group sucks. That's possible, though probably unlikely. That would be hopeful, right? It would be hopeful that if this was all an orchestrated plan, to create a scapegoat for Putin to say the war is over, fine. Whatever. Let the war be over. That would be fantastic. Though, that seems less likely. What seems more likely right now is that there was actually a true split between Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner Group, which, fun fact, the name the Wagner Group came from the call sign of one of the co-founders, Utkin, who was a neo-Nazi. Anyway, fun little side fact. But if there was a true split between the Wagner Group and the Russian government, then this is probably the worst case scenario for Putin. Because in this scenario, you could potentially have just sown the seeds of future rebellion. See, rebellion tends to be contagious. You could, at one hand, create a rebellion that fails. Almost all coups fail. A coup d'etat, a military takeover of the government. Almost all of them fail, whether it's immediately or soon after their takeovers. They almost all fail. But what they do is they sow the seeds of discontent and rebellion to where maybe now the more top brass in Russia realizes, wow, other people are so essentially disillusioned with what Putin is doing. They're willing to drive a convoy of thousands of troops through Russia, plowing through blockades that Putin set up, and Putin puts on a show of setting up turrets and sandbags to fight back. If someone like Prigozhin, who actually had a lot of money and a lot of status in Russia, if he's willing to do that, then maybe other top brass will start thinking about doing that as well, because they see a losing war. See, you have to also ask yourself this. Would there be rebellion if Russia were winning? And this is sort of the outside look in. If your team is winning, you don't rebel against your leader because you're winning. Things are good. You're getting the spoils and everybody's status is being elevated. Everybody's getting richer and winning. When you're losing, people rebel. They get frustrated. And they point the finger. They point the finger at leadership and they say it's these guys that suck. And if we just replace them, maybe we'd have a better shot. So I think the higher likelihood here is not some kind of orchestrated show. It probably was a true split. And if this was a true split, Prigozhin will probably be assassinated at some point in the future. Maybe not within the next few weeks. Maybe he's already a dead man walking. Maybe he's already dead. It's entirely possible that all of his audio messages for the next few weeks have all been pre-recorded and this guy's already dead. And they just shipped his planes empty to Belarus. Who knows? I haven't actually seen videos or pictures of the guy. But even if he is alive, Putin will find a way to end up poisoning him just like they did and have done many times before. In fact, anytime, if you look at Russian history, anytime local leaders start getting really powerful, they end up disappearing. They end up disappearing under mysterious circumstances, or all of a sudden have fallen ill because of some form of chemical, like, I think for the poisoning that I keep referring to, I think it was polonium like 210, super radioactive, but also very difficult to detect unless you're looking for it, because it doesn't show up on a Geiger counter. You have to do really some pretty unique gamma wave analysis. It's pretty incredible when you look into the science of it. And I'm no scientist, but the point is, Prigozhin will probably be killed at some point. And so then the question is, does it matter? Probably not. See, the Wagner Group will not cease to exist. It will probably just rebrand. Much like Blackwater rebranded to the Academy after the disaster that happened in the traffic circle in Baghdad back in the 2000s, the Wagner Group will probably rebrand. And all of the operations that the Wagner Group fulfills will be a rebranded show. And the question then is, will Putin just continue on as normal? And unfortunately, at this point, that is probably going to be the case. You'll probably be in a situation where Putin continues on as normal, the Wagner Group rebrands, Prigozhin gets killed or not, leave that for the future, and the war in Ukraine keeps going. Now, while the seeds of discontent and rebellion have been sown, the question is, who is next most powerful to take on such a sort of rebellion or mutiny like Prigozhin? He had the great opportunity of leading essentially a criminal enterprise. I think he's recruited somewhere around 50,000 criminals, straight up convicts from jail. And somewhere, the latest estimates are that about 20,000 of them have already died on the front lines. So I guess you're down to 30,000 in that case. But anyway, that makes you a powerful person when you have that many people under your control. There aren't many groups like the Wagner Group that could challenge Putin's regime and power the way Prigozhin truly did. And so, while yes, on one hand, it's possible this was all set up as a scapegoat for the failures in Ukraine, and Prigozhin orchestrated this whole plot with Putin, it seems more likely this was a true split. And if it was a true split, the best shot at rebellion failed. And it shows and reiterates Putin's power. Even though the mainstream media is saying, Putin's weaker. Not necessarily. If the biggest potential rebellion failed, oopsies, now you're back to this continuing war. And it's unfortunate because I'd love the war in Ukraine to just end. But I don't know, and I don't believe that this mutiny that we've seen will actually be what people have been hoping for, an end to the war in Ukraine. I think this will be a hiccup for the Putin regime, and they'll move right past it. So it's unfortunate for the end of the war, because the end's probably not near. Now, there's some commentator here, the next rebellion won't be in Russia, it will be in Ukraine against Zelensky. See, but much like I mentioned, you rebel when you're losing. Zelensky and Ukrainians feel as though they are winning. Now, I know everybody can look at individual battlefields and say, really, how? But consider this. Russia expected to take over Ukraine in 3 days. Russia is now fighting to hold on to a sliver of Ukraine. Donetsk, Bakhmut, Crimea, which Russia has already been controlling since 2014. This is a relatively localized issue at this point. And it's not to say it doesn't have international implications. I mean, we know this is essentially a proxy war between the United States and Russia, given that we're essentially funding all of it and training the individuals, where it's just Ukrainians essentially using American weapons. But, that is a way that the CIA and the Biden administration weaken a very strong power. Now, I think that China would actually encourage a resolution to this war quickly, because the longer this war goes on, the weaker Russia's GDP becomes, their true GDP, not what they're reporting, and the weaker Russia's economy becomes. And given that Russia is a massive trading partner for China, and China, Russia, North Korea are allies, it would make sense for China to want their ally to be strong, not weak. Ukraine, given that it's a proxy war with the United States, is weakening Russia, thanks to the support of the United States and Europe, although the United States is outspending Europe by a factor of 2 to 1. And of course, we could debate, the righteousness of funding this proxy war. But the point of this segment is, will the Wagner uprising lead to an end to the war? The answer is unfortunately probably no. It'll probably lead to no difference. It's unfortunate. Yes, Russia is basically fighting NATO. Oh, of course, that proxy war. But NATO is basically the US.
Now, I want you to know this. When it comes to AI, time is what's going to make you money. And if you can prove that value to an employer, you'll always be able to be employed. So this is another way of making sure that you don't get replaced by